outside of Matvei Michkov and the other exciting prospects on the Philadelphia Flyers, the name that has been most talked about this training camp is someone that's not even at training camp, Alexei Kolosov. If you don't know the story and don't know what's going on, basically a Belarusian netminder, 22 years old, signed his contract last summer with the Flyers, signed his ELC, got loaned back to the KHL, played a season there, came back to the AHL, kind of normal development path for a netminder, played a couple games for Lehigh Valley, um, and then everything seemed to be fine. And then unfortunately it came out that he really hated his time here apparently and wanted out and wanted to stay home in Belarus for play for Dynamis. But and then it just all kind of stumbled out of there. There's reports of the Flyers not really cooperating with him, all this stuff, but it's all kind of been swept under the rug and doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. If you want to say that. Um, some stuff is just not passing the sniff test. If it's a player issue, if it's someone that just doesn't really want to be there, if it's just if he specifically just wants to be in the NHL, like Denny Briere and Dan Hilferty said earlier when training camp opened, that Kolosov really just wanted an NHL job and didn't want to go through the AHL process. So it's just been sort of a mess. There's no real ending to this right now that we can see. But there were reports a little bit earlier from Sportsnet's Elliot Friedman that teams are kind of sniffing around on Kolosov, seeing if he specifically doesn't want to play for the Flyers organization. What about if he wants to play for our organization? If maybe he's fine spending in the AHL a little bit because there's a clearer path, even though there's a definitely clear path with the Flyers right now with Sam Harrison and Ivan Fedotov not really like making any kind of argument to be a for sure NHL starter for the next decade. Kolosov should be able to see that obviously like there's a path there. Um so yeah, so that's where we are right now. There's nothing going on, but teams are apparently sniffing around. And the Flyers have apparently reportedly already named their price. The second round pick is fine. He was a third round pick a few years ago. Second round pick for all the trouble that we've been through with him, signing him to a deal, not attending training camp, not attending development camp, all these things, annoying, whatever. Um, the second round pick is fine. So that's where we are right now. And that's where things stand is that he's kind of in this limbo. He's not at training camp, obviously. And teams might be sniffing around. So today we were thinking, what's a team that would be kind of suited for him? What would be a team that would be really interested in the player like Kolosov that need kind of a 22-year-old goalie that has been decent in the KHL, has been kind of average, but he's young. He showed promise. He's like somewhere in the top 20 of goaltender prospects in the NHL, according to some people that follow all the prospects and everything. But what is an ideal kind of ending to this situation, and what's a trade that like kind of makes sense, and what's a team that would be willing to give up like a decent like second and third round pick, whatever, for a player like Kolosov. So today we'll go through some teams that it kind of makes sense. And before we get there, there's some things that have to make sense for a team to acquire Kolosov because there are earlier reports that like Calgary Flames and Nashville Predators specifically are teams that are sniffing around. But in my eye, it doesn't make any sense from that because Calgary Flames have Dustin Wolf, one of the best goaltending prospects, like arguably top 3, top 2, whatever you want to say. They have him, and he is similar age enough to Kolosov that it doesn't make sense that they'd be bringing Kolosov in, him wanting an NHL deal or NHL games, and Wolf is just like, well, I'm here also. Like, does Wolf Kolosov, is that a tandem that makes sense? Like, are they trying to do this kind of balancing act? Um, it doesn't make sense to me. And with Nashville, obviously, they just traded Askarov. They're arguably the best goaltender outside of the NHL for the last little bit. Traded him to San Jose because he's specifically kind of Kolosov situation, but more warranted because he's been heralded as this like the next great Russian goaltender. Um, he's been traded to the San Jose, and Nashville committed to UC Saros. Well, if Kolosov wants NHL games, does he want NHL games specifically as just a backup? Is he going to be Saros's backup for like the end of time? Like Scott Wedgwood is there, signed for 2 more years, as specifically to be just a backup. Like that, does that really make sense to acquire him, have him in Milwaukee, and then when Wedgwood is still there, and like if Wedgwood's good, like Kolosov's never touching the NHL, so it doesn't really make sense. So a team that we have to go through, they don't have to have, or they have to have not a top goaltending prospects or someone committed there long term. Like you'll see as we go through the teams, it's not, we're not talking about Minnesota Wild because they have Jesper Wallstedt. We're not talking about other teams that have these goaltenders that are heralded to be their starters for the next decade. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to Kolosov. It doesn't make sense for the team. Why would they give up assets for that? So let's start with a team that is pretty interesting and probably arguably the best fit Kolosov. Now the Los Angeles Kings are kind of in an interesting situation right now. They have some of the best young players in the NHL right now, Quinton Byfield, Brent Clark coming up on the back end. But in goaltending, they just drafted Carter George, a pretty decent um, goaltending prospects of his own, but he's still in junior hockey. He's still 4 years younger than Kolosov. So in my eyes, it makes sense for the Kings to maybe get this stopgap goalie in this post Jonathan Quick era that they've had to kind of deal with a little bit. Because right now they have Darcy Kemper, who was the return in the Pierre Luc Dubois trade, and basically he was just a cap dump. So does it make sense to really be wanting to be competitive? Because the Kings do want to be competitive. They still have Kopitar, they still have Doughty, they still want to be in the playoffs, and they're still a decent team, especially with the young core kind of on the rise. Does it really make sense for them to be fine with Darcy Kemper? Does it make sense for them to be just like fine with players like Phoenix Copley and David Rittich just going through the motions of just like, well, we're a second and third string goalie, like we have some experience, but we can't take over. We can't, if Darcy Kemper shows that he is the player that got dunked by the Caps earlier, then they'd have no reason to like. Then they probably have to get someone anyways because the David Rittich and Copley is just like Copley, whatever how you say it, isn't reasonable enough or a duo that's good enough to really support the team that wants to be so competitive like that. And we kind of understand that from the Flyers point of view. Is like if the Flyers are really competitive and in the Kings situation and say they still had all these veterans, then and they're dealing with Urson and Fedotov right now. Like it doesn't make sense because the goaltending, and we know it as Flyers fans of how goaltending could kind of sink a team that is so good in front of that goalie. And the Kings are kind of dealing with that. So now is Kolosov the perfect answer? No, but he would be that stopgap in between that would hang out in the AHL a little bit. And if Kemper, Copley, and Rittich just aren't cutting it at all, which like they probably have a high chance of not like being as good as they need as the team needs to be, then and if Kolosov is like spending the next 2 months in their AHL system in their minor leagues, then they would bring him up and he would get AHL time and like there's an easy path there. There's no crazy goaltending prospect that is banging on the door to get NHL time. So Kolosov can be that and be that stopgap. Um, and maybe be like have a Carter George in like 5 years when he's maybe playing in the AHL, and Kolosov could be the backup or vice versa. I think the Kings it just makes total sense. They have a couple picks. They have that 2026 pick. They don't believe they have their 2025 second round pick, but it just makes so much sense. In my point of view, it just makes too much sense with the Kings. Now moving on to the second team, it's in a similar situation with the Kings that it's in the same division, of course, but it's the Seattle Kraken. The Kraken are in a weird situation as well, just like I'm repeating the exact same thing I said about the Kings. But they're in a weird situation because are they going to be competitive? I don't know because last year they took a step back. Um, and this year with like Matty Beniers and hopefully having a decent third season and bouncing back from a little sophomore slump, then they probably still want to be competitive. They still have a bunch of players. They signed Adam Larson to extension. They have Vince Dunn. They have these defensemen that are very good. And of course, their forward group is pretty decent. So on the back end right now, there's depending on Philip Grubauer, who's like a sub 900 goalie the last few years, and the other player off the top, I forget, Joey Decord, who's like was recently called up from the AHL, played I think 30 or so games last year and played pretty decent, but there's no consistency there. There's no cement like concrete tandem that can win some games for the Kraken. So I think if they get Kolosov again, easy path. That's the whole thing. Easy path of how does Kolosov get to the NHL? Well, you get traded to a team that like a bad month or so, and suddenly you're in the NHL. You're have your chance. You have your opportunity to maybe get there and make the next step and be solidify yourself in the NHL that he wants to be, according to reports. So the Kraken just makes total sense. They have picks. They have this desire probably to kind of make that next step and be like, we're not going to be missing the playoffs anytime soon. We want to stay competitive. We're a new team. We're showing that our first year was not a fluke. Um, and yeah, I think the Kraken just makes total sense. It's just kind of similar to the Kings in the situation, maybe a little less because they don't have the established superstars that the Kings do, or the like, but they do have the top tier young talent. Um, but it just makes sense. It just makes sense from my point of view. Now, if we're talking about a team that is in a fresh situation and wants to make a point, we're of course talking about the Utah Hockey Club, pending Yeti, pending whatever they want to be called. Um, Utah made a big splash this offseason. They obviously got Mikhail Sergachev, they got John Marino. They want to be more competitive and shed that Arizona Coyotes stink that they have just surrounding that whole franchise. They want to be known as a decent team and not be a laughing stock and not take on these albatross contracts and be this like team that just sucks the life out of the league. Um, no offense to any Coyotes fans. I don't know why you're watching this, but no offense. Um, but it's just like this Utah wants to make a splash, and I think obviously they have Carroll and Melka, however you say that, and Connor Ingram as their tandem, and those two players are very decent. They're very good. Connor Ingram, like probably the best unknown goalie in the NHL right now. He's been very, very good. He has a great Twitter account too, and he probably is in a similar situation with Kolosov with a little bit. He just needed a chance. Both of those players are old enough that they're coming up on unrestricted free agency, and it just makes total sense that if Utah were to acquire Kolosov, it'd be more of a long term thing. But there's a clear path there. These are players that are much older than him. So if the issue with Urson being on this team, then being a similar age to Kolosov and him not seeing that like a clear path, like, oh, you chose Urson, like there's gonna be like a stop gap. There's gonna not a stop gap, but there's gonna be a blockade, or I can't overtake his job because he's similar age. Um, so if that's the issue with the age, then these players are older. Then you could see him getting acquired, maybe spending the whole year in the AHL, and then taking that next step at 23, 24. He's now Utah's team, Utah's goalie, starter, etc. If he makes that same development path. And now he could have done this with the Flyers, of course. Of course, we know, like I said earlier, obviously there was a right path. There was a specific path to him becoming the Flyer starter if he performed the way that he believes he can perform. But if he's already soured on the fact of being in Philly, then Utah is a little bit of a better situation, and it kind of just makes sense in my eyes. Now, another team that kind of makes sense for Kolosov to get traded to kind of hurts a little bit. It wouldn't feel great, but it also makes sense. And if we're talking about Utah, how these they're two existing goalies, because of course the NHL season is right around the corner, so it's not like these teams are searching out for goalies and they have NHL jobs ready. But if we're talking about goalies that are kind of on their last legs and they're not going to be there for a long time, obviously, and Kolosov sees a path to maybe becoming the starter in a year or two, then the Washington Capitals kind of makes sense. And it might be a better situation than even Utah because the team is still trying to be competitive, but they're playing this weird balancing game of we're trading for these players like Pierre-Luc Dubois, like I mentioned, Andre Mangiapane, et cetera, et cetera. But they're not giving up a lot. They're not sacrificing their future to make sure that Alex Ovechkin has a good time in his last few couple of years and he's able to break Gretzky's record. So they're not sacrificing their future, but they're still adding this NHL level talent. Now in net, because they got rid of Kemper, they have Charlie Lindgren and Logan Thompson. Logan Thompson was newly added. Charlie Lindgren was Kemper's backup last year, played pretty well. Both of these players are unrestricted free agents at the end of the year. The team could just walk away and have a complete empty situation in between the pipes for heading into 2025-26. So Kolosov really should be able to see that and be like, there's an opportunity there for me to get this job, for me to claim the Capitals job and be able to establish myself within the Flyers division as a starter. That they have picks, they Caps have picks, and it kind of just makes sense if they want to plan a little bit of the future while also thinking about now because Kolosov could be a decent goalie in the near future. By the end of the season, we could be talking about Kolosov being an actual NHL player. We don't know. That's the whole thing. That's what's annoying about this is that there's a whole mystery about this. But what we could see is the Caps kind of getting Kolosov, potentially having him in the NHL, but they're still thinking long term. He'll be here for the next decade or so, until he's 30, whatever, if he's actually as good as he thinks he is. So I think for the Caps point of view, it makes sense. Flyers, that would hurt, but it would be kind of a win-win for two because also if Kolosov doesn't make it, then you're just like, well, we told you, like, whatever, you got to deal with it. And I think that's where the Caps kind of fit into this. Now, one of the last teams we want to talk about, not the last team because we have two more, is similar to the Caps that it is going to really hurt, and that's the New Jersey Devils. Obviously, they acquired Jacob Markstrom to really figure out their situation because the entire reason why the Devils didn't make the playoffs last year, outside of okay, maybe they were too injured or whatever, it was totally on the net miners. The goaltenders, whatever tandem they had, I think they had Vanacek or something. Um, it completely synced their season. So they got Markstrom, but he's only under contract for 2 more years. And that is kind of a situation that Kolosov could easily take that easy development path that so many goaltenders do. UC Saros, Tuukka Rask, probably the oldest example in my lifetime that I kind of know and it kind of clicked of him playing under Tim Thomas, but UC Saros played under Pekka Rinne. You play under these established goaltenders and then you're able to take over. It's a tale as old as time. But Kolosov could easily be Markstrom's backup and develop and play well and do all of these things. And then he could find himself being the Devil starter if he's playing well enough and wants to take on that workload. It's just a situation that kind of makes sense. It's unfortunate for the Flyers that it's traded to the Devils of all teams. But yeah, it's just unfortunate. It kind of makes sense from everyone's point of view, but it's just stupid. And finally, the last team I want to talk about that could figure out this Kolosov thing and potentially be reap the benefits of a player hating Philadelphia so much. Maybe I don't want allegedly sprinkle the whatever the so we don't get sued or anything. Whatever. The team that I want to talk about is Edmonton Oilers. It's obviously out of every single team I mentioned, maybe the Kings are the best, but Kings are the best. But the Oilers have the most pressure and are the best team, and they have an immense amount of pressure to win and to do something while Obviously, Draisaitl side of the suspension, but while McDavid is still there, and it just makes sense for them to really try to figure out their goaltending position because Jack Campbell obviously didn't work out. Stuart Skinner was decent, obviously through the Cup final and stuff, and that's their starter right now. But it's still like it's total wishy washy. It's like you don't know if it's goaltending. At the the whole the whole point, the whole underlining thing that could be through this is that no one knows what netminder and what goaltender is going to be good season to season. So Kolosov could be end up being the next Shesterkin or whatever, but obviously not because Shesterkin was lights out and already in the North America or whatever. But it's just a total fluke. It's a guessing game. You're estimating with these players. So with Skinner, it he'll probably be the starter for a long time, but Kolosov could be that backup and actually get NHL time because they don't really have anyone else. They don't have that backup that they really need and can depend on if in case if Skinner gets injured. So if the Oilers go out and get Kolosov, because again they don't really have any goaltending prospects, um, then it kind of makes sense from their point of view to be looking forward, but also, and again, it could be the situation where Kolosov could play the NHL next season, but it could make sense that the Oilers kind of plan forward, but then also have, in case of an emergency of Skinner getting injured, say in January, February, Kolosov is playing lights out in Bakersfield. I think that's where their AHL team is. Um, and then Kolosov is suddenly in the AHL, established himself. He's named backup, whatever. They all live happily ever after. Um, so it kind of makes sense for the Oilers. And all these teams, all six of these teams, it kind of makes it's a difficult situation because you want to say, well, like Kolosov started AHL, which obviously he will because the NHL season's around the corner. They already have teams. Teams already have their tandem figured out. There's no team that's like, oh well, Kolosov's available. He's going to be our backup. No, they already have a backup situation. They already have this two or three goaltenders in the NHL that are already figured out. They're already going to be there. So Kolosov's starting in the NHL no matter what if he gets traded. Um, so it makes all the sense in the world for to be a little skeptical of well, if he's getting traded, why can't he just do that for Philly? Why can't he just do that for the Flyers and hang out with the AHL? It might just be because he was soured on it or just doesn't like the vibe of whatever. I don't know. Uh, but maybe this team could lay out more of a development plan, be more clear, like with the Caps, be like, these guys are free agents at the end of the year. It's your job for the taking. Like, if you show that you're good in the AHL this year, then you're getting it in the NHL next year. If he was in Philly, that might not be the case because Fedotov was better than him in the KHL, albeit older, 5 or 6 years older. And then Harrison is here, and he's more firmly established in NHL. So um, you can kind of see it from his point of view. So I think if he were to get traded, it makes sense with these teams. But in the end, it might just be a waiting game. It might just be a situation where the Flyers hold up. The Flyers say, well, if you're not doing this, then we're just going to let you live in limbo and be in Belarus and be in Minsk and train with the team or whatever. Obviously, we're not loaning you to officially to the KHL, so you can't play in KHL games. But you're going to be hanging out, and unless you kind of make your decision and decide to come to the AHL actually, or make a change, have a change of heart, then it's going to be kind of a waiting game. But if he gets traded, if he's on the market, then we can definitely see it happen with the other teams. We really hope you enjoyed this video and podcast. You can find us on YouTube, obviously, if you're here watching it, like and subscribe, all those things. If you're listening to the podcast feed, please subscribe there. It really helps. Rate, review, all those things. We love it if you just participate. And obviously, we would love it even more if you subscribe to BroadStreetHockey.com. You can read an article that I actually wrote exactly like this, outlaying it. It's $5 a month or 16 cents a day. 16 cents. That's nothing. You'll find that and just be like, oh, that's in the garbage now because it's 16 cents, whatever. So yeah. So just please subscribe. independent Philadelphia Flyers coverage. We love you. Thank you for watching and listening and reading.